Your lecturer is Dr. Bob Breyer. Dr. Breyer, recognized as one of the world's foremost experts on mummies and Egyptology, is a senior research fellow at LIU Post. He earned his Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Breyer is the author of several books on Egyptian history. In 1994, he became the first person in 2,000 years to mummify a human cadaver in the ancient Egyptian style. This research was the subject of a National Geographic television special, Mr. Mummy. Dr. Breyer was also the host of TLC series The Great Egyptians.
Hi, I'm Bob Breyer. Let me begin by telling you how delighted I am that you want to learn hieroglyphs. In some ways, it'll be like learning any other language. There are vocabulary words to be learned, grammatical rules to be followed, and some homework will be necessary, but not too much. In these ways, learning ancient Egyptian is like learning Spanish or French, but I think it's actually easier. One reason for this is that we will not be learning to speak it. Middle Egyptian, which is the phase of the language that we'll be learning, is a dead language. No one speaks it. So most of our efforts can be devoted to learning to read it. There will be no Bonjour, je suis Bob Breyer, or Me llamo Bob Breyer. We don't have to divide the lesson into reading and conversation. You're not going to encounter any talking mummies. That will save a lot of time. Something else that makes learning hieroglyphs relatively easy is that we don't conjugate verbs. No je suis, tu es, il est. Again, this saves lots of time and memory space in the brain. Unlike Romance languages, we don't have to remember which nouns are masculine and which are feminine. We won't have to worry if boat is masculine or feminine, or what gender pen is. The reason is that almost every feminine noun ends in a T sound. If it has a T at the end, it's feminine. If not, it's masculine. So there are a lot of features built into the language that make it learner-friendly. We only have 24 lectures together, but I think we'll be able to make considerable progress. By the end of the course, you will pretty much understand how the language works, be able to translate some rather complex sentences from real texts, and when you go to museums that have Egyptian collections, you will have a much, much better understanding of what you're looking at. Hieroglyphs will be our doorway into the culture. Let me point out that I've been saying hieroglyphs, not hieroglyphics. The carvings and drawings of birds, feet, gods, and boats that we'll be studying are hieroglyphs, not hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphic is the adjectival form of the word. Indeed, we will learn a hieroglyphic script, but the symbols that make up that script are hieroglyphs. Okay? So I don't want to hear anyone saying hieroglyphics anymore. The word hieroglyph comes from the Greek. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt around 332 BC, they saw the carvings on temple walls and called them sacred carvings. Hiero for sacred or priestly, and glyph for carving. We won't be doing any carving in this course, but we will be learning to write the hieroglyphs on paper. I think you will find this especially enjoyable. There's something calming and rewarding about writing hieroglyphs. It's an end in itself. I will show you how to draw many hieroglyphs step by step. Even if you have bad handwriting, you can learn to write reasonable hieroglyphs. I have a poor handwriting in any script. I'm old enough that when I was a kid, it was considered wrong to be left-handed, and we were forced to become righties. In kindergarten, I wrote with my left hand, then was switched in the first grade, and I never had a decent handwriting in any script. When I learned Greek, I had poor Greek handwriting, and it was the same with hieroglyphs. Later, when I was teaching hieroglyphs and writing on the blackboard, my poor students wound up copying my terrible handwriting. When they would go on to graduate school, my colleagues would see their handwriting and say, "Oh, you're Bob Breyer's student." This was not a compliment. Then something happened. Many years ago, an old friend, the Egyptologist Jeffrey Martin, was staying with me in New York, and he sat in on one of my classes. I was going over a homework assignment, and Jeffrey, dear soul that he is, was appalled by my handwriting. He walked up to the board, took the chalk from my hand, and said, "Bob, this will not do," and proceeded to show the students how to properly draw the hieroglyphs. Jeffrey and I are very close, so this was just fine with me, and my students thought it was hilarious. He convinced me I had to change. Fortunately for me, at this time, my secretary, Sheila Martinez, was an artist who had been to Egypt with my students and had a beautiful hieroglyphic handwriting. She began teaching me how to change mine. It took an hour a day for quite a while, but today it's decent. Not wonderful, but my students are not singled out for their poor handwriting anymore. If I could change my hieroglyphic hand at the age of 40, I am sure you will be able to draw excellent hieroglyphs and take pride in your achievement. In the next lecture, I'll show you how to draw the primary hieroglyphs. And in our exercise book are step-by-step instructions for each one. Drawing the hieroglyphs will be a significant aspect of this course, and I think you're going to have a lot of fun with it. Each lecture, I will introduce new vocabulary words, which is the most important part of learning the language. If you know your nouns and verbs, you will usually be able to make sense of a sentence. So vocabulary is very important. Again, our exercise book has a small dictionary of the words we'll need, but I suggest you make your own handwritten dictionary. This will give you extra practice in writing and will also help you remember the words. We'll talk about your dictionary a bit later in the course, so don't worry about it right now. Often, you will see printed hieroglyphs on the screen. I used a program called JSesh, capital J, capital S, E-S-H, to produce these hieroglyphs. Sesh is the ancient Egyptian word for scribe. I'm not sure what the J means. It may stand for the computer language Java. JSesh is a program created by Egyptologists, and it's free online. So if you want to write your hieroglyphic notes to your friends, or on your computer, or print hieroglyphic birthday cards, download JSesh. Now, a word about books. As we go along, I will suggest some books that I think you might enjoy. The one I want to mention here is very highly recommended. It's Sir Alan Gardner's Egyptian Grammar. It's big and imposing, but don't be deterred. It's wonderful and you'll love it. It's a book that most of us learned our hieroglyphs from, and it's still a standard. It has many exceptionally useful features. First, it contains a rather complete dictionary, so you can look up any words you don't know. Second, it lists all the hieroglyphs, explaining what they are, what sounds they represent. These are organized according to what they depict. So all the birds are together, all the people hieroglyphs are together. Then, Gardner tags each hieroglyph with a letter, according to the subject, and a number. So a particular bird hieroglyph is A1, and another is A2. A hieroglyph of a particular god might be C11, and so on. So, if you see a hieroglyph you don't know, you look it up in the sign list, get its number, and then go to a longer hieroglyph list, look up A22, and you get an explanation of what it is, how it's used, what its sound is. It's really great fun. JSesh uses Gardner's system of numbering hieroglyphs to call up the hieroglyphs. The Gardner book also provides sequential lessons that teach grammar and vocabulary. And at the end of each lesson are homework assignments, sentences to translate, not only from hieroglyphs to English, but also from English to hieroglyphs. Unfortunately, the answers are not in the back of the book. Sorry. This is the kind of book that you will love to thumb through just looking for new words and texts. In this course, I try to follow Gardner's lessons closely enough so that after you've completed all the lectures, you will have a good enough background to continue your studies in Gardner's book. I like the idea that Gardner's exercises use texts from real monuments. Most are not made up. I've had to change his examples a bit because we don't have all the vocabulary he assumes, but still, it's close enough that you'll feel at home in Gardner's book. So I strongly suggest you get a copy of Gardner's Egyptian Grammar, which you can find online or order through a local bookseller. Let me make a suggestion about how you should watch this course. No binge watching. For some courses, that's just fine. You become fascinated with the subject and just want to keep going. My hope is that you'll be fascinated with this course too, but it will be better for you to do just one lecture per day. That way, you can let the hieroglyphs sink in. Have time to think about them, and then spend 20 minutes or so writing them while doing the homework. Now, that's enough housekeeping for today. I want to leave time to explain why Egypt had to invent writing. It's not an accident that Egypt invented writing and the native tribes of North America didn't, even though those tribes lived much later. You have to have a certain kind of society to need writing. Let's see what made Egypt that kind of society. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. At least that's what Herodotus said around 450 BC when he visited Egypt. Herodotus was a Greek tourist who was blown away by Egypt's wonders. The pyramids, the temples, the mummies, they all astounded him. Herodotus traveled everywhere, and when he retired to write his history of the world, he devoted an entire book to Egypt. It's great reading, and I recommend it highly. You can get it in paperback, but the important thing for us is that he is the first to mention, in print, the importance of the Nile. I believe the Nile is one of the main reasons why Egypt had writing. Let's look at a map. Ancient Egypt was bordered on the east and west by desert, which isolated it from other countries. It was not easy to cross a desert in the ancient world. You had to dig wells, make preparations, and so on. The Egyptians were not desert dwellers. They feared the desert. Remember, they didn't have camels in ancient Egypt. Camels were introduced later, around Roman times. On the north, Egypt was bounded by the Mediterranean. Again, not an easy boundary to cross, especially since Egyptians were not good sailors. They knew how to sail on the Nile, which was a piece of cake. You didn't have to navigate. You could see both banks at all times. Also, the winds were almost always from the north. So if you were going south, you just put up the sails and off you went. When you wanted to return, once again, it was easy. The current flows from south to north. So take down your sails, steer with your oars and tiller, and you're on your way home. Our last natural boundary is the southern one, which in ancient times was at the city of Aswan. Here we have a cataract, large boulders in the river. Again, making passage difficult both into and out of Egypt from the south. So, Egypt, to a great extent, was isolated. Deserts on two sides, Mediterranean in the north, cataracts in the south. How did it survive? Indeed, not only survive, thrive. Here is where Herodotus' statement about Egypt being the gift of the Nile is so important. It isn't a metaphor. It's literally true. Let me explain. Once a year, in July, the Nile overflowed its banks and deposited rich black soil on both sides of the river. For us, this is a natural phenomenon. Each year, monsoons in Ethiopia, to the south, bring torrential rains that wash rich topsoil into the Nile. So we can understand this easily. But for the Egyptians, It was a magical event. What they saw was that the Nile first turned dark brown from the topsoil suspended in the water. Then the river turned green from the slower moving vegetation being washed north into Egypt. And then the river rose 30 feet. Pure magic. You see, the Egyptians didn't know the source of the Nile. They never went that far south. And the reason Herodotus' statement is literal is that when the Nile overflowed its banks and inundated Egypt, it deposited the fertile topsoil. The rich black land of Egypt is indeed the gift of the Nile. The Egyptians fully appreciated how important the Nile was to them. They made offerings to Hapi, the Nile god, who was shown as simultaneously having both male and female traits. He's clearly male, but he has one female breast. The idea is that by himself, he gives life to Egypt. Now, for the connection between the Nile overflowing and writing. The annual inundation fertilized the land of Egypt every year. There was no soil depletion, no need for fertilizers, and Egypt could grow more food than it needed. When you have surpluses, you want to keep track of them, especially if you have a system of taxes. And boy, did Egypt have a system of taxes. And that's where writing comes in. You need writing to keep track of the taxes that were due and the taxes that were collected. But there's another reason why Egypt had to have writing. They had a pharaoh as ruler. To explain this, let's look at the world's oldest official document of an event, the Narmer palette. Let me first explain what a palette is and how they were used in ancient Egypt. Both men and women wore eye makeup. This makes sense in a desert country to reduce the glare from the sun, very much like football and baseball players today smear black paint under their eyes. Now, how did the ancient Egyptians make cosmetics? Pretty much the same way we do today. I'll tell you a funny story. Years ago, I was at a local fast food place called Pudgy's Chicken. In spite of its unfortunate name, it served chicken without skin, which is much more healthful for you. As I was waiting to pick up my order, I asked the kid behind the counter, what happens to all the chicken skins? He told me that every night a cosmetic company picked them up. That's how some cosmetics are made, with chicken fat as a base. It was the same in ancient Egypt. You took a little duck fat, there were no chickens in the old world, mixed in a bit of ground malachite, and presto, eye makeup. Palettes were used for grinding these cosmetics. So you took a nice piece of slate, carved it into a pleasing shape, and you had a surface on which to grind your makeup. Now, let's look at the Narmer palette. We are looking at what is traditionally believed to be the front side of the Narmer palette. You'll notice that it is very large and not a nice smooth surface. It's not really practical for grinding cosmetics. We think it was a ceremonial palette created to celebrate an historical event, and that event is the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Originally, Egypt was divided into two kingdoms, Upper and Lower. Upper is in the south, because when you went south against the current, you were going up the Nile. So Upper Egypt is below Lower Egypt. I know it's confusing, but you'll get used to it. Now, let's see what's happening on the palette. The first thing you notice is the large figure in the center. He's the king, and we know that because he's wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt. In his hand, he holds a mace, basically a rock on a stick, and he is about to smash his captive, whom he holds by the hair. I can tell you the king's name. It's Narmer, perhaps the very first king of unified Egypt. You'll see how I know that in a minute. Above the captive is a falcon holding the head of another captive by a nose ring. The falcon is the symbol of the pharaoh. The 6 papyrus plants that come out of the stylized body of the captive may be hieroglyphs for 6,000. Each plant is 1,000 in hieroglyphs. So Narmer may have taken 6,000 enemy and defeated them. That's the headline, but there's lots more to say. Look at what Narmer is wearing. A kilt. And coming down its back is a bull's tail, a symbol of his power. He also wears a false beard, another symbol of authority. You can even see the chin strap holding it on. Now look behind Narmer at the smaller figure. It's his sandal bearer. And I think he's carrying a pot of water for when the Pharaoh gets thirsty. Behind that little guy are the hieroglyphs for the word servant. The hieroglyph on top is traditionally called a rosette, but it appears to be flower petals of some sort. The hieroglyph beneath it is a small club. These are very early hieroglyphs, carved at the beginning of the written ancient Egyptian language, so we aren't exactly sure what they mean, but we have a good idea. The rosette appears in front of other kings' names, so my bet is it means king. The little club in later Egyptian texts means servant, so the little guy with the sandals is the king's servant. But don't think he's just a lowly servant. He is actually an important official. Around his neck, he's got a cylinder seal on a cord. This shows he was high up in the hierarchy. Also, just being represented on the palette must have been a great honor. Behind the captive may be the name of the town he comes from. We're not sure. Remember, these are very early hieroglyphs, carved around 3100 BC, right at the beginning of writing. Beneath Narmer's feet are 2 fleeing enemies, with their towns apparently indicated by the hieroglyphs above them. Now, how do I know the king's name is Narmer? Look at the top. 2 representations of a cow goddess look down on the scene, perhaps in approval. But between them is a rectangular structure called a serech that represents the facade of a palace. There are doors and windows. Inside that rectangle are 2 hieroglyphs. The one on top is a catfish, which was pronounced nar in ancient Egyptian. Beneath it is a chisel, pronounced mur, nar-mur. That's how the first king's name was pronounced. Now, let's look at the second side of the palette to see the end of the event commemorated. The second side of the palette has the same top with the cow goddesses and the name of Narmer in the palace facade. Beneath it, however, we have something different. A procession, a victory procession. Narmer is now wearing a different crown, the short red crown of Lower Egypt. He came from the south, conquered the king of the north, and now rules both north and south. Egypt is unified. His name is very prominent in front of him, Narmer. In the procession that precedes him is a figure that's larger than the others. The hieroglyphs above him are not his name. They mean vizier or prime minister. I think you can see his stooped posture. That's because he's wearing a leopard skin. It's the sign of a high priest, and it's not an easy garment to wear. It's not tailored, so he's bent over, holding the heavy garment on. The smaller figures hold standards, perhaps the divisions or towns from which the army came. They're walking towards decapitated bodies that have their hands tied. Don't mess with Narmer. Beneath this procession, we see 2 mythological animals with their necks intertwined. This is unusual. They appear only in a few other times in Near Eastern art, and we don't know exactly what the beasts represent. Here, they may well symbolize the unification of the 2 powerful lands. At the very bottom of the palette is a bull, simultaneously breaking down a walled city where he tramples on the enemy. The bull is yet another symbol of the pharaoh. The Narmer palette is important for several reasons. Because of its historical content, and because it's very early writing describing the beginning of Egypt as a great nation. But it's also important to ancient Egyptian art. It sets standards, conventions that would be followed for 3,000 years. First, it shows hierarchical proportions. The more important people are shown larger. Just look at Narmer on the front compared with everyone else. Second, the smiting of the enemy pose will be the logo for Egypt, the very symbol of the country. It appears on temples for the next 30 centuries. Third, the falcon and the bull will also reappear over and over again as emblems of kingship. Fourth is the practice of placing the action on registers. People don't just float around, they stand on something. The palette is divided into sections, which makes it easier to read. As I mentioned before, the Narmer palette is a very early example of Egyptian writing. If you think about the hieroglyphs on the palette, you'll see that they're not sentences. They're really more like labels. They give Narmer's name, the vizier's title, perhaps the captive's name. They don't tell a full narrative. We have to fill in the blanks, guess at the full story. Everyone always assumed that both sides were carved at the same time to commemorate a single event. This may not be correct. Let me tell you about something I noticed on the palette that suggests that possibly we don't have the right story. Years ago, I was waiting for someone at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and he was late. We were supposed to meet at the Narmer palette, and since I knew he would be late, I decided to use the time to take a very close look at the Narmer palette's hieroglyphs. As I looked at both sides, I became convinced that I recognized two distinct handwritings, one on one side of the palette, one on the other. Let's look at the rosette next to the sandal bearer. See how it's drawn on two sides. One side has 7 petals, and on the other, only 6. This is a handwriting. The same person isn't going to write the hieroglyph so differently. 2 different people did this. Also, look at the serech, the palace facade. See how simply, almost crudely it's drawn on the reverse side? Compare that with the other side. Much more complete. Even Narmer's name is drawn differently on the 2 sides. The catfish in his name is quite different from side to side. I am absolutely convinced that the 2 sides were carved by 2 different artists. The question is why? I don't know. Perhaps one side was carved and then some time elapsed and it was decided to carve the second side. Now for the even bigger question. Which side was carved first? I have an idea. It's a half-baked idea, but I think it's interesting. My guess is that the side with the intertwined mythological beasts was carved first. After all, it's a palette, and where the necks intertwine is the only suitable place for grinding cosmetics. Sometime later, the second side was carved. So that would mean that what we've been calling the front is the reverse. We may be telling the story backwards. I'm far from sure about this, but what is clear is that if you know a bit about hieroglyphs, you will look more closely at them and see things that others miss. Anyway, the Narmer palette definitely shows us just how important the king is in Egyptian civilization. This also led to the development of writing. In Egypt, the pharaoh was viewed as a god. He had absolute power, owned all the land, and didn't have to worry about committees approving his decisions. With such centralized power, the pharaoh was capable of marshaling all the manpower of Egypt for his purposes. If you have a great king, you can do amazing things, like building pyramids. Also, you can organize the farmers so that just before the inundation comes, you need a calendar for this, they begin digging irrigation canals so that more land is irrigated and more crops can be grown. Then you can collect even more taxes. And this requires writing more than ever. And this surplus leads to yet another reason why Egypt had to have writing. If you grow more crops than you need, you can support a large class of people who don't contribute to the economy, and you can serve in an army. Now you don't just call out the farmers when invaders are coming. You have a trained army, equipped, that can easily defeat them. Wait, even better. You can march out with your professional army and invade other countries, like Palestine, Syria, Turkey. Then you beat them up, take home everything that isn't nailed down, and tell them that if they don't send an annual tribute, you'll be back. Now, the army is not a drain on the economy, it contributes to it. Egypt had the first professional standing army in history. They loved war. It was good business. But they had to keep track of the thousands of soldiers in different divisions. So once again, they needed writing. The idea is that Egypt was the world's first great bureaucracy. It had surpluses that had to be recorded, taxes to be collected, armies to keep track of, and all this required writing. We've looked at the first historic document in the world, the Narmer Palette. Not only is it an introduction to hieroglyphs, but it's a statement about the role of the king and how important he was. We also saw how Narmer wrote his name. Next time, we will learn how to read and write our own names in hieroglyphs. For now, though, I want to leave you with your first hieroglyphic assignment. I don't want you to do any research. Just look at the following hieroglyphic sentence and see what you think it says. I know you don't know much about hieroglyphs yet. All we've seen are the few early hieroglyphs on the Narmer Palette. Pretend you're a medieval scholar trying to decipher a language that has been lost for more than 1,000 years. See what you come up with. I'll see you next time.